There's a number of species that possess the ability to detect light in a way that doesn't involve seeing or vision in the traditional sense. The ocular structure, or the eye, has tissue that can detect light, and this information is relayed to the brain, where it's processed into a visual image that the mind of the organism can perceive. The organism's mind, the consciousness within the biomatter, uses this visual image processing to get a real-time, light-based awareness of its surroundings. That's not what happens with non-visual photoreception. This is a little harder to describe, because it's not as intuitive and it's a little more subtle, but it basically involves any kind of tissue that responds to light. Sometimes the animal is only aware of this sensory perception through secondary effects. For example, many reptiles have a parietal organ and a pineal complex that can sense daylight, and this feeds into the animal's circadian rhythm. Now the reptile isn't literally seeing the sunlight through a third eye on the top of its head. It's only aware of this light sensing secondarily. It's only aware of it in the sense that it sleeps when it's tired, and it's active during the day, or if it's nocturnal, during the night. It's aware of these states. It's aware of the fact that it's tired and wants to sleep. And when it's awake and alert and doing stuff, it's aware of that fact. But it's not consciously aware of how the circadian rhythm is being influenced by the light cycle that it's exposed to. For another example, there's dermal photoreception, which can induce a behavioral response, where, depending on the species, the detection of light will encourage movement towards or away from the light. Species that like to hide in dark crevices will reflexively shy away from the light, while other species might be attracted to it for particular evolutionary reasons. I want to tell you about a recent study that examined this dermal photoreception in sea snakes, because, well, I thought it was really cool and really interesting. The authors begin their paper by explaining a little bit about photoreception, much like I've just done, except they did it in far greater detail. Then they focused on dermal photoreception in species like lampreys, hagfish, aquatic salamanders, and sea snakes. In all of these species, their tails have photoreceptive cells. When lampreys and hagfish detect light in their tails, it makes their tail reflexively flick back and forth, so that they burrow into the lake bed to hide. This is an innate defense mechanism to keep them burrowed in the silt, so that they're hidden from predators. In sea snakes and aquatic salamanders, when the tail detects light, the tail will reflexively retract to shy away and hide under reefs, or to hide under an overhanging rock ledge. The researchers give a really interesting hypothesis for why this kind of photoreceptive behavior would have evolved. They describe an evolutionary context where these species were under selective pressures to avoid predation, and they cite contemporary data about the abundance of tail injuries on sea snakes, or how these tail injuries make them less efficient movers, less able to get food and avoid predators, and less likely to survive in general. The authors say, quote, "These selection pressures may be particularly strong in animals with vulnerable hind bodies and tail paddles that are anatomically remote from the concentration of sensory organs on the head," unquote. This is basically saying that if you have a long snake-like body and your tail is far away from your brain, it makes evolutionary sense to evolve some kind of tail-based reflex response so that if your tail is exposed to some ambient threat, it can at least have this basic reflex defense mechanism. Because sometimes having an active, conscious signal being sent all the way from the brain, it takes a little too long. Only milliseconds, but sometimes that makes the difference between being maimed and getting away scot-free. Sometimes milliseconds is the difference between life and death. So there's already a pretty decent amount of data about this, but the researchers wanted to know more. They wanted to dig in deeper. Their experiments involved 17 wild-caught sea snakes, belonging to 8 different species that included representatives of every major lineage of sea snake. First, they used different wavelengths of light to stimulate different points on the sea snake's tails. These experiments confirmed the phototaxic tail withdrawal that was seen in previous studies, and it also discovered that the trait exists in two new species, two species that we didn't previously know could do this. They also found that the sea snake's tails responded most strongly to the light wavelengths between 457 and 514 nanometers, which to our eyes is blue and green light. And this makes sense, because blue and green light would be the colors that they would detect during the daytime while underwater. That would be the wavelengths that would reach them in that medium. However, the researchers also found that 5 species of sea snake did not have this phototaxic tail response, which suggests that it was an emergent trait early on in the clade, but then many species lost the trait as time went on. This is explained by the fact that when they compared rates of tail injuries in the various species with and without the phototaxic ability, they did not actually see any significant difference. Having the phototaxic reflexability doesn't seem to make any significant difference to their ability to avoid being injured. So what this tells me is that millions of years ago, these sea snakes lived in an evolutionary context where they experienced a strong fitness benefit from having this ability. Perhaps their predators were more numerous and more concentrated in the same rocky and reef-covered habitats that the sea snakes lived in. Thus, when this defensive trait appeared, it was selected for and preserved, at least back then. But over time, the evolutionary context seems to have changed. Perhaps there are fewer predators. Perhaps they don't live in the same exact habitats and the same concentrations anymore. Whatever the case may be, this trait seems to have become less useful, as in the modern day, it doesn't seem to confer any significant advantage anymore. And because of this, a majority of the sampled sea snake species have subsequently lost that trait. This last part about the changing evolutionary context is just me speculating based on my interpretation of their data, so don't take it as a hard, concluded fact. I don't know if this is the case for sure, but I think, in a general sense, that something like that would have had to have happened. This study is interesting because it doesn't just explore deeper into the phenomenon of non-visual photoreception in the tail of aquatic vertebrates, but it's also interesting because it gives us some insight into the changing evolutionary pressures that these organisms were exposed to, and how some of their evolved traits that were once useful don't seem to be all that useful at all anymore. It's an example of how the environment and how life in general is perpetually changing and always evolving. Nothing ever stays the same.